Welcome to Tools for Liberty, a program designed to intrigue you, to stir your nerves, and to offer your mind critical thinking and adventure. I'm J. Dylan Proctor.
I'm Amanda Sparrow.
And I'm Anthony Allegria.
Today we're discussing the money pit, how not to be a tornado, and then we will again return to the conversation about roaming virtues.
Alright, so as we're going to start off today, we're going to talk about the money pit, as in the money pit. And I think just start off this question by asking, have you ever heard of the money pit?
So the money pit is an actual place. It is on Oak Island, which is off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada.
And this is something where there is a History Channel series on this. I didn't know this until recently, that History Channel was doing a series on this. The history on it is much interesting, more interesting I would say than just what the History Channel has turned it into as sort of a reality TV-esque thing. It's got a long and one of those things where there's a lot of conspiracy theories involved in it, but it's really fun. But the purpose of this conversation is to go in the direction of how we build character, how we invest ourselves. So let's just start off today by hearing the story of the money pit and see what we can learn from it. So it all begins in 1795. You can go back in time just a few hundred years, and there were some teenagers who were out on this island. It's just a little bit off the coast of Nova Scotia. And as they were on the island, they noticed that there was a block and tackle hanging from a tree. And not only this, that there was a depression on the ground there, and it didn't have much growth going inside of it, so it was clear that there was something man-made about this pit, because why else would there be a block and tackle hanging from a tree, and why would there be this depression without growth in it? So they decide they're going to go get some shovels, and they start digging. They get about 10 feet down in this hole, and you know what they find? They find a floor. And they realize that they've actually struck something which might be quite interesting. So they keep digging. They remove the planks that are there, that are the floor, and they dig, and they get another 10 feet, and they realize they find another floor. And they go another 10 feet, and down at 30 feet, they realize this is going to be a big task. So they make a pact with one another that they're going to come back in the future and deal with this pit. After they get older, they have more resources, they're going to come back and find the treasure which is here. About 10 years later, they make it back to the island, and by this time, the group now has some investors, they have some other people involved, and they've got a little bit more money and financial resources to use better tools to dig in this hole. So they come back to the pit, and they continue digging. And as they go a little bit further down, they get down to 40 feet, they get down to 50 feet. They keep finding that about every 10 feet, there's a floor there. There is a layer of something, whether it be planks put there, some sort of flooring is put every 10 feet. And they make it all the way down to 90 feet, and they make an interesting discovery when they get down there. They get to 90 feet, and they realize they've hit something solid. It's something that's a bit like rock. It could possibly be some form of concrete. And at 90 feet, they find this solid floor, and they also found a slab, a sort of a cryptic slab that's this stone that's got things written on it. And it's not written in a language they're familiar with, some sort of cryptic language on a stone. And they realize they finally made it. They've made it to the treasure. So they climb back up out of the pit, and they say, this has been a great day. Tomorrow we're going to come back, and we're going to have the treasure out of this, and it's going to be awesome. So they come back the next morning, and they find that the pit is filled with water. And doing what people do, they say, oh my goodness, we just invested all this time. We're going to get the water out of here. We didn't just get that close to the treasure to have it robbed from us. So they try to pump the water out, and they realize they can't. They start digging around the pit, and what they realize is there was traps set up so that when people started digging in the pit, it would activate these channels which were coming from the bay, which was right off the again, this is a small island, so they're relatively close to the sea and the Atlantic Ocean, I should say. And they realize that there's water coming in, and there's these traps which have been set. And they fight this water. They try to get the water out of it so they can continue on going. And they never succeed. And this is, again, the early 1800s by this point, and at the time they didn't have the technology to get the water out effectively. So they had to leave the pit. And the pit is untouched for about 45 years. Finally, some other people come to do investing, and they say, we're going to figure out what treasure is in the bottom of this pit. And we see this pattern which begins not only with the first teenagers that were there, but at time and time again, people put together expeditions to do treasure hunting, to get the water out of this pit, to dig around the pit, and they all have failed. Even to this modern day, nobody's been able to figure out what's in the bottom of this pit. People have tried to make the pit wider, make it about 100 feet wide. They've tried to dig beside it. They've tried to go all the way down and go up under it. They've tried to close off the traps which allow water to come in and fill the pit. And nobody's been successful in figuring out how this pit works. They've dug about 200 feet in this, and they've gone all the way down. And again, the pattern continues. Every 10 feet or so, there's another floor. There's another layer of stuff. And people have never been able to figure out what is down there. Well, here in more modern times, with better technology, people have gone there with robots, and they've gone there with some things more capable of doing scanning of the ground. And they've looked at this, and without giving away much information, that's the way people do in this sort of thing, they've hinted that it's worthwhile to dig here. And in the past, as explorers have gone and treasure hunters have gone and fought this hole, at one point in time, they had a drill that they drilled down in this pit, and when it came up, it supposedly had chain on it at one point in time, gold chain, to be exact. And around the island, they found some interesting things. They found some old swords, which may be consistent with the time of the Knights Templar. Around the island, there's these rocks which sort of make a cross on the island, which don't appear to be naturally occurring. It looks like people have placed them there. And there's jewelry and things and pottery they found on the island, all which make for a very fascinating story, because it appears that there is some sort of valuable treasure in the bottom of it. And especially with modern materials that we have in modern scientific equipment, when people go and they scan it and they say it is worthwhile to dig here, it's very tempting to. But at the same time, it's ruined companies, it's ruined investors, and it's even claimed 6 lives of people who have been here working at the pit trying to get things out of it. People have died there, people have lost fortune, they've lost everything trying to get to the treasure at the bottom of the money pit. And so this is where I want us to be thinking about today.
What does this have to do with building character?
So the story we just heard about this money pit, it's kind of interesting. It sounds almost like the beginning of a National Treasure spinoff, or anything like that. It's an interesting story, but like Anthony asked, so what does this really have to do with our conversation? In life, we have resources, and we have not just financial resources or material resources, but also the resource of our mind, of our character, of just our whole life. And how do we invest those resources? We can use our resources to pursue deep, mysterious treasures that end up costing us everything, like this money pit, where seems like the further they dig, the more trouble they get in. Or do we invest in things that maybe can produce actually good things, that could produce things that maybe they're not the exciting, mysterious treasure deep within us, but they can be something that's productive and helpful for us and for others.
Right, and really I want our conversation to go towards the direction of those mental resources we have, our character. It may be bizarre to hear this, but we have to be stewards of our character and of our minds. I firmly believe the greatest resources we have are the ones that we maybe can't reach out and touch. They're the resources within our mind, they're within our hearts, they're within our very being. How do we invest those resources is a huge question. Because again, we can invest in the money pit, we can invest our character in things which are not necessarily the wisest decisions, or we can develop ourselves into somebody very meaningful. And what I mean by that is, in pop culture, there's this sort of idea that if you just be yourself, everything will always work out. But this is something which is a little bit different than what we may arrive at if we just think about this critically. And it's even different than what Jesus says a bit about things. So I want Anthony to read from us out of John 15, the first 2 verses there, because there's something really interesting about this.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit.
All right, this is a really powerful statement. It reveals a lot about Jesus' character. Jesus said this, as in the Jesus, made the statement that every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, he being the Father, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. Jesus is making the statement that even himself was working on developing his character, becoming somebody who is capable of bearing fruit in a very powerful way, in a very constructive way in the world around us. As we are individuals, we are challenged to always be bettering our character. Do we want to invest in things that end up like the money pit, consuming us, taking our life and our resources, or do we want to invest in things which are actually going to bear fruit? It's fun, and you can make a great coloring book about watering plants and watering flowers. It doesn't make so good of a coloring book a picture of somebody with a giant set of shears going out to prune the garden, and the hard work and labor that can go in raising crops and gardening. But this is a fantastic tool for becoming someone better. If we're aware of how we're investing our resources and we invest them in things which are wise, This is something which is very, very powerful.
So this conversation does kind of bring us to a more difficult place, and we hope that it helps stimulate in your own thinking of your own life, of where you invest in your character, and is it someplace that will produce good fruit, to use the analogy that Jesus does, or is it something where we kind of let ourselves run wild and given into this idea of, well, we can just do whatever we want or however we want, and to use to be yourself. Whatever that is, and we can find maybe some misplaced joy in saying, well, I am who I am. But we have to remember that oftentimes our first inclination may not be the best one. It can actually produce some very harmful things to others if we're only thinking about kind of what we want or how we want to do things, and it really ultimately will hurt us as well. And we have that, and we see it prevalently in our culture. But as we kind of explore the story of the money pit, and then as Jesus speaks about pruning, we're called to something a little bit more difficult, but it will ultimately be more beneficial and helpful, is to look at ourselves and even to look at our culture and say, what's unnecessary? Furthermore, what is harmful? What's kind of taking up the nutrients that is kind of feeding off of what actually is going to produce fruit? And how can we prune that? And how can we not just do things because we want them to be done or how we want them to be done, but what is the best way to do it, and kind of move past this kind of be yourself humanism?
And I would say this, with the idea of the be yourself, it is something where you can go out to a store and buy a poster, an encouraging poster that says be yourself, and you sometimes have the question, well, what does that even mean? Because we really want to be more than just ourselves. There are times in life when we need to prune things, and there are times in life when we need to water certain traits. A great example that I've used that's pretty simple and straightforward. When I was younger, when I was in high school and when I was in college, or when I was an undergraduate, I made the statement that I never wanted to proofread a paper. I was never going to pull an all-nighter, and I was never going to turn something in late. When you look at those three things, I did make it to the end of my bachelor's degree, and I did fairly well with that, with not ever doing any of those things. And looking back at that, I'm like, I'm really dumb. The whole deal with I'm not ever going to proofread a paper was pretty ridiculous. That was pretty dumb of me. That is something that needed to be pruned, and was pruned after that before I moved on to other things in life. But while the attribute of saying you're not going to procrastinate, that's actually good. That's something that you do need to invest in and give nutrients to, where at the same time the whole mentality that says I'm never going to proofread anything, that's pretty dumb. That one needs to be pruned. That's taking up nutrients. Yes, that's a trait you have inside your character, but that's one of those things where it's the money pit. You can invest in that. And yeah, at the end of the day, you may be able to have the reward of saying, I finished college never proofreading a thing, but what have you gained at the end of that? Yeah, the treasure at the bottom came at the cost of everything else. So it's really, really dumb, really, really silly. We need to be people who are going to use the tool of pruning ourselves. It's not so fun to think about pruning, but it's important. One other illustration we have for this is the idea of the tornado. So when we talk about ourselves and we talk about our world around us, so many times in our world we imagine the inner self being so important. If I can just be me, then I'll be right. What that really is this mentality that your life is sort of the circle and everything is sucked to the middle of it. That is a tornado. The money pit is a tornado. It's this thing of centripetal force where there's something spinning and it pulls everything to the center. You may have heard of centrifugal force, things that spin and everything is pushed to the outsides. The opposite of that is centripetal force, where everything is pulled to the center. The money pit is a tornado. And as people, don't be a tornado. Don't be the person where your whole life is designed by centripetal force, where everything is sucked to the center and you want to move things to your inner self without any consideration of the people around you, without any consideration of your environment and how your decisions may be holding you back instead of helping you out. We need to be people who are focused on and how do we develop ourselves. And a good tool for that is learning to prune.
In the past, we've discussed G.K. Chesterton's statement that madmen and bad ideas can be hard to overcome because they are like circles, and they're small, closed circles. Chesterton describes Christianity as a circle as well, but it's a much larger circle because it uses centrifugal force. It spreads and grows because the force to move outward and invite others in.
So this is a massive contrast to the mentality that just simply says, be yourself. When we, as in life, we're people who we look to the world around us. We want to involve ourselves in the environment. We want to spread. We want to be healthy. We want to negotiate out life with other people. We don't just want to look in the mirror and say, this is the whole of reality. We don't just want to look to deep within ourselves and find out what our ego likes and flourish that. We want to be people who prune the things which are holding us back and invest our resources in things which will help us grow.
Well, I think in continuing this conversation, something that kind of hit me recently is this odd doublespeak that happens in our culture, that there's simultaneously happening. There are people who wish to be only identified or participate in life in this group. And then that way they kind of, the consequences, but also the rewards can be shared. And then at the same time, it is, well, the only thing that's, important, the only thing that matters, the only thing that decides what is right and wrong, what is appropriate or inappropriate, what is blessing or curses, is how I feel or I want it to be. And so there seems to be just this pathology of both collectivism and individualism happening simultaneously. And we as the church call people to participate in a community, not to lose themselves, but to find what does it mean to participate in something that calls us to be the best that we can be. That we are not going to just be ourselves, whatever that is, unbridled and unpruned, but that through cultivation and through that pruning, we can actually be this the best and this helpful thing that can create real and lasting change in our world and in our culture and in our communities.
So on that, don't be a tornado. Jesus was big enough to say he has to prune and cultivate. Be someone who prunes and cultivates. Don't be a tornado. All right, for our next segment, we're going to be talking about G.K. Chesterton's Chapter 3, The Suicide of Thought. And this is the book Orthodoxy. It's a really great chapter, and he talks about this issue with roaming virtues. So let's get caught up on that.
To bring us up to speed in our conversation, in our previous Midweek Liberty episode, we discussed the issue of roaming virtues. When a structure like the church falls, not only are the vices let loose, but also are the virtues. It's easy to imagine the vices escaping, but the roaming virtues can do far more lasting damage. For example, Chesterton discusses the virtues of truth and pity that have escaped and become detached from their proper relationship with the world. In the case of pity, we see that compassion, but no truth, is what most people are holding on to.
And this is something which is really fascinating. It's easy for us to imagine if something falls, like the structure, if the role of the church falls in society, there's this argument that, well, people will become immoral, they'll indulge in the vices of life. That's really easy to see. It's really predictable, and it does happen to a certain extent. Chesterton's making the case that really the most damaging thing happens is something which is a bit less obvious, when the virtues themselves become wild and they roam and they become unconnected to one another. They get dislodged. They're no longer working in tandem with their proper place in the world.
We can see even now, so as he's writing this in the early 1900s, and how we have, or different systems have tried to create their own virtues, and it's through these disconnects that sometimes cause the greatest damage versus just kind of the blatant vices or sins.
And I think a really good example of this, and not to give too many references, but the 2008 X-Files movie was based on this idea that people could have their heads taken off their body and then put on somebody else. What made that such a disturbing movie and / episode from the X-Files series was the fact that it's real. It's actually based in reality. There's people who did these experiments and tried to do this. When you separate the virtues out and you say we want to learn to do things like organ transplants, then the question becomes, well, how do you ethically learn to do this? If you go to the X-Files show, it was they just sort of kidnapped people and were going to chop people's heads off and hook equipment up to them to keep them alive and cool during the duration of the transplant, and you get some really crazy stuff. But this stuff has happened. We can look back in time, we can see what was going on in the 20th century. There's been a lot of bizarre experimentation. People were actually experimenting with taking limbs and heads off of animals and putting them on other animals, and there's even speculation they were doing this with people. It's really disturbing, and this is what happens when you separate the virtues out. When you have truth, but you don't have any empathy, you don't have any emotion, having truth alone doesn't necessarily tell you how to behave in the world. You need something to correlate with that. And when you have pity, all you want to do is give people a hug, but it's not connected to truth. Bad things can happen too.
So now we're going to go into our Chesterton reading. But a much stronger case than these two of truth and pity, which we brought up earlier, can be found in the remarkable case of the dislocation of humility.
All right. So I want us to take a few seconds and think to yourself, what do we think of when we think of humility? If somebody says the word humility, what image pops in your mind? And then what would it look like if humility is dislocated, like a dislocated shoulder?
If a man would make his world large, he must always be making himself small.
One of the things that I find so interesting about this chapter is when I think of humility, and while we were doing some preparation for the program today, I was saying my thoughts on humility is simply somebody kneeling before a throne. They're in like a throne room and there's somebody laying prostrate and they're sort of down. They've shrunk themselves down. But when I imagine this in my mind, I realize there's not even anybody on the throne. There's not any other people in there. There's just a lot of static and empty space. And the image in my mind is really incomplete, which often that's the case with the image we get in our mind. And there's a lot of gaps in it. Chesterton makes the argument that humility is not just about the self. It's about recognizing that we're small in a much larger world.
So there's kind of two movements or two recognitions that are happening here. If we kind of stop at the first one of understanding that we're a small part, we're going to stick with the self. And we're going to find that we really even can't be truly humble in that because it's still focused on self. So we find ourselves very prideful in our humility. But if we move on to see that the world is bigger and complex and there's these issues and circumstances and other people that are happening within the realm of the world, then we find, yes, that we are quite small compared to the immensity of our world, but then it is supposed to then spur us to do something about that, to participate in our world and not just to focus on how we can make ourselves small, but how we can participate in the large world.
But what we see suffering from today is humility in the wrong place. Modesty has moved from the organ of ambition. Modesty has settled upon the organ of conviction, where it was never meant to be.
One of the things we really see in our society, and we talked a bit about this in the past, about how people they've invested in the wrong things. They have invested in things like Hollywood to be moral tools of guidance. They've looked to people that are celebrities to be role models, when really these are not people who should be role models. Good quality people should be role models, whether or not they're celebrities. And we see this with the idea of humility. People have dislocated things. They've moved humility from something to do with ambition, where we recognize that we're small and the world's large and we're going to go out and do something about it, where now humility is an issue of conviction, where we're emotionally convicted and we're emotionally invested in things that we should not be invested in. A lot of people have been upset over the Hollywood thing, and there's a right reason to be upset over the Hollywood thing, but we shouldn't be so emotionally invested in these people that it really comes as that big of a surprise. When people do bad things, they should be dealt with accordingly, but we shouldn't be so emotionally convicted in things that things go just an unhealthy path. People should not be morally convicted about stuff that is not worth being morally convicted about. Earlier we were talking about people who are morally convicted about whether they use iPhones or Androids. I know the new iPhone came out. Those are not things worth being moral conviction. That's a dislocation of things.
And again, it establishes the self kind of being the predominant factor in deciding what's right or wrong. Like we talked about in our first section, this kind of be yourself mentality is, if that's all we're stuck with, we're not going to actually find anything productive or helpful or beneficial in our lives. And it's just going to be this kind of perpetrating continual just self-harm and then into our community. Because, I mean, if all we're concerned about is being morally convicted about which phone we use or about which movie we're going to watch or anything like that, or what's going to, we're going to get upset because sporting events happen or don't happen or whatever, or what those athletes do, then we're going to find ourselves fighting the wrong battles, right? No real change is going to happen. And when he talks about, because initially when you hear those words, conviction versus ambition, if I were to say pick which one's the right word and which one's the bad word, you'd probably go, okay, conviction's the good word and ambition's the bad word. And what Chesterton is saying, though, is this ambition's not a selfish ambition. It's an ambition to go out into the world. But if all you have is conviction, this kind of self-righteousness, then you're just going to be perpetrating harm, not benefits. All you're going to be doing is being selfish, not actually humble. You're going to call it humility because you have great conviction and drive behind it, but you're not actually going to be that which is a virtue, that which is going to be helpful and beneficial in the world.
A man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth. This has been exactly reversed. Nowadays, the part of man that a man does assert is exactly the part he ought not to assert, himself.
And that is really something which speaks for itself. The fact that people no longer are doubting their self and their own capabilities. They doubt truth. They doubt things which are stable in society. And we see this play out time and time again. This is what happens when people start to take the idea of moral relativism and they start to say, well, things which are good aren't really good. Things which are holy aren't really holy. Things which are sacred aren't really sacred. We see this movement away from people become 100% sure of themselves. The way I view myself right now is perfect. We see people who are people even in my own age group who think they are capable of running the entire world's economy, even though they can't organize their own financial situation. They can't organize their bedroom. They can't keep things in order within their own home. And yet they have this conviction that they are not doubting themselves, but they're doubting the truth. They're doubting everything but themselves. And it's really a flip on humility. And you do see this, to Amanda's point earlier, where people, and I see this even within the church, where people will come in and they will confess all the things they've done, but it's very obvious it's not done in the sense of I want to work through this. It's somebody come give me brownie points, somebody come give me special treatment because I've told you all the things I've done bad, and now I have this stature. I have this. It's really a prideful humility. It's some way of saying you're pious because you're confessing your inadequacy instead of actually dealing with the problem. It's all about you.
Right. And so this is where we talk in confession is in connection with repentance. And repentance is turning from one thought to a new thought. And so when we look at our world and we see this kind of false humility or this false piety in seeing where we want to go, is if we're starting with ourselves and how we can make ourselves better, then we're not going to do anything that we're going to set out to accomplish.
The old humility was a spur that prevented a man from stopping, not a nail in his boot that prevented him from going on. For the old humility made a man doubtful about his efforts, which made him work harder. But the new humility makes a man doubtful about his aims, which will make him stop working altogether.
It's so amazing this was written over 100 years ago because so much of it's come true. Of course, the name of this program is Tools for Liberty. We want people to have tools for going out into the world and being productive, having personal liberty, not just relying on the forces of the world to change your fate. And Chesterton makes the argument that the old humility, the old disposition where you realize that you were small, the world was big. He even makes the example that when we look at a tower, the tower is tall when we recognize that we are small and the tower is big. Our perception of the tower is really important. It humbles us to look at large buildings, to look at magnificent things, because we see the scope of the world. We see where we fit in the world. And when we can have a fairly decent understanding of where we fit in the world, again, the world is more complicated than we're going to be aware of it. But when we understand that we are small in this massive world, that does not be a spur to stop us, but that gives us encouragement to go out and do things. Go out and be productive. Don't just doubt truth itself. Don't doubt reality. If we have doubts about anything, we may have doubts about our own capabilities, but it's extremely unhealthy and it's not humble to think that you yourself are completely sane and completely without questioning in your understanding. And really is taking humility to the place where realizing that you are small and the world is massive, but go out and do something in it. Don't just doubt reality. Don't just doubt truth.
Well, I think kind of it off your example of the tower, we can look at, and also where Chesterton talks about whether it is the spur or a nail that kind of like seals where we are, is this idea of fear and understanding our circumstance. There's a good healthy amount of fear that says when we look at a large problem, I need to think about how to overcome this, right? I can't just go out and wing this. Or it can be, we can take fear out of its place and it could stifle us from ever doing anything to conquer, or it can disillusion us where we think, oh, it's really not that bad. I can just go out and I'll conquer the tower. It's not really that big. It will be fine. And then we find that we've pretty well epically failed. So understanding the world as it is, looking at that which is reliable, gives us the tools, not hope that it will give us the tools not to stifle us, to create us to be kind of catatonic and fear the great big wide world, but actually to help us to see how we can work within it.
one of the things that I want to throw in before we read a little bit further is this idea that humility is not self-centeredness that's like the tornado that sucks everything to the middle. It's self-awareness that's a proper self-awareness. It's a self-awareness that's not self-centered. It's a self-awareness that says we're centrifugal in the sense that we are going out, we're doing things. We realize the world's complex, but we have an awareness of where we fit in that and that we can go out and be productive.
We are on the road to producing a race of men, too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. We are in danger of seeing philosophers who doubt the law of gravity as being a mere fancy of their own. Scoffers of old time were too proud to be convinced, but these are too humble to be convinced.
One of the examples I've heard of here in recent days is there was a student who was writing an essay about the movie Schindler's List, and they were reviewing some of the things that the Nazis were going on, and they had been asked to critique this movie. And when they had done it, they had outlined a lot of stuff that was going on with the persecution of the Jews and the genocide and whatnot. And the sort of final statement they had at the end of that was, "But who am I to judge the Germans?" And the answer that we have to that is, well, I might let Amanda answer that. As a human being, we need to have tools for judging things. We don't need to be to the point in life where we have such doubt of ourselves that we're not able to think.
Right. You are human. You have the right and hopefully the resources and the mental resources to judge and judge appropriately. And to remind you, when we've talked about this word judging, it's evaluating, it's understanding, it's making the correct corrections in how we maneuver in our world. And so by all means, when we go up, and especially against these great forces of evil, we can say, no, you're evil. That's just kind of plain and simple. And we're not going to kind of hide ourselves or think of ourselves one way or another and to say that we don't have to be involved in the world around us.
It is exactly this intellectual helplessness which is our second problem.
And that's where we're going to end our reading from Chesterton today, because he discusses humility and how when humility gets dislocated, it takes people to a place of intellectual helplessness, which is really an unfortunate place to be. And again, this verse was published in 1908, but a lot of the stuff has really come to fruition. We do see a lot of people who are really at a state of intellectual helplessness, but I have hope that this is not where humanity is going to end. We're going to move beyond that. In order for us to do that, we have to realize that we're not just going to be people who are like tornadoes. Humility should be something which is a tool for building life, not a tool for just looking inside and being the massive whirlwind that just sucks everything to the middle and shuts you down, where you can't function, where you can't make an intelligent thought, you can't respond to things well, but takes us to a place where we say, we realize where we're at in the world, we realize that we're sort of small and there's a lot of magnificent things in the world, and we're going to go out and we're going to do something with it.
Well, we hope you have enjoyed this episode, and we ask that you would continue to follow us in all our various mediums on Facebook, YouTube, I think we're on Twitter, and other mediums like that. Please feel free to share comments, also to share our videos, and that will be the best way that we can get our material out there.
And thank you much. Have a blessed day.